On the 11th of March 1869, the French priest Father Armand David was walking home to his church in the remote Baoxing county of rural Sichuan province in China when he was approached by Li Pinshan, a villager he knew, who invited Father Armand home for a cup of tea. Mr. Li knew that, beside being a Catholic priest, Father Armand was also a trained scientist with a keen interest in the local wildlife, and he had something he wanted to show the priest. Inside the house, sipping his tea, Mr. Li brought to him the fur of a large animal, the likes of which Father Armand had never seen before. The pelt resembled nothing so much as that of a bear, but Father Armand did not recognise the delicate black and white patterns that appeared on the pelt. Noticing how interested he was in the pelt, Mr. Li told Father Armand that hunters from the local village were about to go into the mountains, and he wondered if the priest would be interested in them bringing back a specimen to him. Intrigued, Father Armand said yes. A couple of weeks later, Mr. Li's hunters showed up at Father Armand's front door with a specimen of a large, dead animal. Father Armand was a little upset that he hadn't brought in a living specimen, but set to work examining the creature. His examination proved what he had initially thought in Mr. Li's front room, that this was indeed a species previously unknown to science. However, to get confirmation of his initial investigation, he would have to send it back for further analysis in a proper scientific lab. Luckily, however, Mr. Li had brought this pelt to perhaps the person most qualified in all of China for this task. For you see, Father Armand was at this particular moment in 1869 having his salary paid for him not by the Catholic Church but by the French government. He was on a mission of sorts, yes, but not for one for God. Instead, he was on a mission for science. He had been tasked by the scientific authorities back in Paris to do a survey of the flora and fauna in the hinterland of China. As such, Father Armand had extensive contacts back in Paris, especially in the Natural History Museum. Over the next few weeks, Father Armand managed to get a live specimen of this new type of bear, and he would ship it and other samples back to Paris. Unfortunately, the bear would die in transit, perhaps because the captors did not understand his strict dietary requirements. However, what came back to Paris was enough for Father Armand's zoological partner, one Alphonse Milne Edwards, to confirm what Father Armand had supposed in his initial field report. This was indeed a species that had been previously unknown to science. The next year, Milne Edwards would publish a scientific paper, making public for the first time the discovery. And with that, Father Armand officially became the first European to have ever encountered a panda.
Panda, panda, he can rock.
It would be incorrect to say that Father Armand had discovered the giant panda. Chinese people had known about the existence of the panda for thousands of years. The bones of one, for example, have been found in a 2,000-year-old imperial tomb, while historians are pretty certain that a Tang dynasty emperor probably sent one as a gift to their imperial counterpart in Japan. What might be more accurate to say is that the Catholic priest awakened China's love for the panda. Today, the panda is a national symbol of China. You will encounter panda iconography everywhere you go as you travel across the country. And the creature represents a multi-billion-dollar industry for Sichuan province alone. And this cult of the panda is fully sanctioned by the Chinese government, as you can see from my t-shirt of pandas as party cadres leading the people. Another example might be that during the 2022 Winter Olympics, it was the panda that was chosen as the mascot for China in the face that the country represented for the international sporting community. Yet, what is sometimes referred to as pandamania doesn't really start until Westerners start to take an interest in the animal. Yes, panda bones have been discovered in ancient Han Dynasty tombs, but in the thousands of years of Chinese art and iconography, the panda is largely absent. The Chinese were, of course, aware that the panda existed, but it was just one of many peculiar animals that happened to haunt the vast geographical extent that is China. And by the time Father Armand visited, human activity had meant that the once extensive range of the panda had shrunk to perhaps something as small as half a dozen isolated valleys in the Sichuan highlands. Father Armand had ensured that, in the 19th century, it was France that would take the lead in the scientific research into the panda. By the 1880s, there were a total of 4 taxidermied pandas scattered across the various scientific museums in Paris, where they remain gathering dust to this day. Yet, in his 1913 entry in the Catholic Encyclopedia, it was Father Armand's discovery of the Pierre David deer, this thing right here, and not the panda that takes pride of place. The panda is briefly mentioned, but only as a black and white bear. As this entry in the Catholic Encyclopedia would suggest, the French scientific community were interested in the panda, yes. However, this cute beast had yet to find its place inside the heart of the public. But this would all change with the arrival of the Americans. First, of course, came the hunters. In 1929, an American hunter would gain the dubious distinction of becoming the first non-Chinese person in history to shoot and kill a giant panda. Transporting the trophy back to the States, the trophy sparked some public interest, and it would lead one recently widowed American on an adventure of a lifetime into the depths of rural China to find a panda of her very own. It may have been the French priest, Armand David, who would discover the panda for science, but it would take the rich American widow, Ruth Harkness, to make him a star. In 1936, Ruth Harkness was experiencing something of a crisis. She was in her mid-30s, childless, and her rich husband had recently died. She had a lot of money and a lot of time, and not much idea of how to spend either of them. At some point, she got the idea that she should go to China and see these cute pandas in the wild for herself. Later, she would say that it had always been her husband who had been the adventurous one, so perhaps this was some kind of way to pay tribute to his memory. Whatever the reason, in early to mid-1936, her plans became more concrete when she made the acquaintance of the 22-year-old Chinese-American Quentin Young. Young's family had a lot of experience in helping foreigners find pandas. It had been his brother, for example, who had guided the American panda hunter to find his prey in 1929. Young was, therefore, a pretty good companion for the rich American widow on her quest. It probably didn't hurt that he was also very attractive, and we know that Harkness quickly became smitten with him. They would start a sexual liaison on the boat over to China, which would carry on throughout their time in Asia. They would arrive in Shanghai in the late summer of 1936 and would leave inland on the 26th of September. Travelling for several weeks, they would arrive in Sichuan province in early November. And almost immediately, they would come across a panda cub lying alone in a bamboo grove. Quentin was quick to seize the panda and give it to Harkness, saying that a gunshot that they had heard earlier in the day was almost certainly a villager shooting and killing the mother of the panda cub. As far as I can tell, Young based this theory almost solely on a desire to make happy the rich widow who was both paying his salary and keeping his bed warm at night. We now know that pandas will often be left alone by their parents as the parents go and forage nearby. What this means is that 2 Americans almost certainly inadvertently kidnapped the cub from a mother who was foraging in the nearby bamboo. Now, in fairness to Harkness and Young, researchers would not discover this until much later in the 20th century, and in the years to come, many more panda cubs would be inadvertently kidnapped by well-meaning humans who believed that they were saving them from abandonment and almost certain death. Harkness also seems to have been better at caring for pandas than Father Armand had been, since she got her panda, whom she christened Sulin, back to her New York apartment healthy and whole. She'd also needed to use a certain level of ingenuity, since she had to smuggle the panda out of China disguised as a dog, which meant that the border guards back in Shanghai were 100% certain pandas could not leave the country, and also 100% unclear about what dogs looked like. The panda would stay in her New York apartment for several months as Harkness set about negotiating with zoos. In 1937, Harkness would reach an agreement with Chicago's Brookfield Zoo to house Sulin permanently, and later in that year she would return to China to kidnap yet another panda, this time christened Mei, to become Sulin's companion. In 1938, she would also publish a book chronicling her adventures. With all this, Ruth Harkness had sparked the first true panda craze in the United States, and back home in China, The Chinese government, who was at that moment fighting for its very life against Japanese aggression, took notice. For in this Ruth Harkness promoted panda craze, they saw an opportunity to turn the panda into a secret weapon in their war. The panda was about to become China's most adorable ambassador. By the beginning of the 1940s, China was indeed in a bad way. Already one of the poorest countries on earth prior to the war, Japan in the 1930s had seized some of China's most valuable provinces. China needed economic, military and diplomatic aid, and it needed it very, very badly. In this context, America would become a high-profile target of Chinese diplomatic efforts. Song Mei-ling, the First Lady of China, would make several tours of America in this period, and became the first Chinese person to ever address the Houses of Congress. The panda played a role in all of this. In 1941, two would be sent to the Bronx Zoo in New York City as a gift of gratitude from China to the American people. This is probably the first instance in the modern world of panda diplomacy, which is China's use of its strategic panda reserve to build up diplomatic goodwill in a target country. And, based on contemporary media accounts, it seems that the American people were pretty taken by this gift of the pandas. However, the declaration of the People's Republic of China in 1949 would be a disaster for panda lovers in America and all across the West, for almost immediately Chairman Mao would cut off America's access to the panda. Now, to be fair to Mao, Westerners had been stealing the panda at quite a remarkable rate in the decade or so since Ruth Harkness made her first trip into the Sichuan Highlands. Now, to be clear, China did not stop sending pandas abroad in this period. But what they did do was shift their focus from the Americans and the West to the Soviets and the Communist bloc. And this shift in Cold War allegiances for the panda led to what I think is perhaps the greatest moment in all of panda history. A segment of the video I am calling From Russia Without Love. In 1957, the mayor of Beijing would send to Moscow two pandas as part of a goodwill exchange. The pandas would prove just as much of a hit in Russia as they had been in America, but the Soviets were left a little unhappy. They complained to the Chinese that they had expected a breeding pair, but instead Beijing had sent them two male pandas. Beijing zookeepers were baffled. They were pretty sure that they had sent a breeding pair. But in 1958 they agreed to Moscow's request and replaced one panda, called Chi-Chi, with another, called Anan. Upon returning to Beijing, handlers examined Chi-Chi to see where they had gone wrong, only to learn that the Soviet zookeepers, unfamiliar with the anatomy of pandas, had misgendered her. Chi-Chi was indeed a female. This presented a problem, since the new panda that Beijing had sent in exchange had also been misgendered, for Anan was male. Moscow had accidentally talked themselves out of a breeding pair, and a looming Sino-Soviet split cut off their access to more pandas. So the moral of the story here is, don't assume anyone's gender, I guess. At the same time, Chicago Zoo were desperate for new pandas. The last of Ruth Harkness's pandas had died in 1948, and they really wanted a new star attraction. So in 1958, they would enlist an Austrian animal trainer called Heini Demner to aid them in capturing a panda. Somehow he managed to convince the Beijing Zoo that they should give him Chi-Chi, who he immediately renamed, but I will continue to call Chi-Chi throughout this video just for clarity's sake, in exchange for 3 giraffes, 2 rhinos, 2 hippos and 2 zebras. He then attempted to return to the US, where he encountered a problem at the border. You see, this was the height of the Red Scare, and the US Department of Commerce didn't like what they would term Chi-Chi's communist background. She was denied entry into the United States. So Demner now had a stateless panda on his hands. He was unwilling to go back to China, and he could not enter the United States, and so he did what any enterprising animal trainer would do. He took her on a grand tour of Europe to see if he could drum up interest in the animal. And it worked, for at the end of the tour he would sell to London Zoo Chi-Chi for around £12,000. But London wasn't happy with just one panda. They wanted cubs. The problem being, though, that the United Kingdom did not have the best of relationship with China at this point. But then someone in the London Zoo had a brainwave. For London had a female panda in one of a male, and over in Soviet Moscow there was a male panda in one of a female. Because while Chi-Chi's original companion had died in the interim, Annan had just kind of been hanging out in Moscow Zoo in this intervening set of years. So, the London zookeepers and the Moscow zookeepers would set up a blind date between Chi-Chi and Annan. After a very long, intense negotiation, Chi-Chi would return to Moscow, to much fanfare, making her perhaps the best travelled panda in all of history. But very quickly the zookeepers encountered a problem, because this blind date was a complete disaster. As much as they tried to set the mood, these pandas were just not interested in each other. Thinking perhaps that it was Moscow that wasn't setting the right mood for the couple, the two were transferred back to London. But still, these pandas showed zero interest in each other. By the early 1970s, panda lovers were in crisis mode. China had by this point cut off pretty much everyone apart from the North Koreans from one of the cutest and most popular animals in the world. And the only two pandas that the public had regular access to just did not like each other. This meant that when Chi-Chi and Annan were to die, there would be no more pandas. But then came salvation from an unlikely source. Richard Milhous Nixon. In 1972, Richard Nixon visited China. This would represent a huge swing point in Asian and global history, in which America, and then most of the rest of the Western world, would switch diplomatic relations from the Republic of China, held up in Taiwan since losing the Civil War back in the 1940s, to the People's Republic of China, capitalled in Beijing. And just as back in the 1940s, China would sweeten the deal by sending the Americans two pandas, Ling Ling and Xing Xing. The adorable Ling Ling and Xing Xing would be housed in Washington DC's National Zoo. They would become even a larger hit than Su Lin and Mei. On the first day that their pen was open to the public, they would attract around 20,000 visitors. And that next Sunday, over 75,000 people would queue for about a quarter of the mile round the block just to see these two adorable pandas. The US would, in return, send its own animals of goodwill, two musk oxen called Milton and Matilda. Now, I don't want to speak ill of musk oxen, but I can't help feel that China was a little bit shortchanged here. Now panda diplomacy entered its golden years. China would send more pandas to more countries than ever before during its long process of opening up. Later in 1972, for example, Japan would be gifted two pandas as part of the negotiation leading to Tokyo restoring diplomatic relations with China. And Ted Heath, the British Prime Minister, would receive two pandas for London during his historic trip to China in the 1970s. In all, China would gift pandas in a total of 20 separate diplomatic incidents in just a decade after Nixon's visit. So, we have been talking a lot about pandas in the Foreign Service. But what have the pandas back in China been doing all this time? In the 1970s and 80s, China was engaged in panda diplomacy like never before, and this meant finding pandas like never before. Unfortunately, this was leading to a problem, because in the uplands of rural Sichuan, the panda was becoming harder and harder to find. In the 1960s, China had established its first ever panda reserves, but these were, in the words of the World Wildlife Fund, empty shells. They existed on paper, but lax enforcement of existing laws meant that on the ground the reserves were very little different from the land outside those reserves. China's rapid economic development had also put further strains on panda habitat. Between 1975 and 1985, panda habitat area contracted from 30,000 square kilometres to only 13,000 square kilometres, and the wild panda population would go from 2,500 to a mere 1,114 in the same period. At the same time as China's international image was being tied to the panda like never before, the panda was hurtling toward extinction. Yet crisis caused action. In 1988, China would pass its landmark wildlife protection law, which would tighten legal restrictions around panda safety. Killing a panda, for example, was now a death penalty offence. And they also encouraged the local police to enforce these laws. In 1992, China's Ministry of the Forestry also got to work, adding more protection to the 14 existing reserves and adding 13 more. From the early 1990s, approximately 60% of panda habitat was now protected. In the late 1990s, there was then a shift away from punitive measures toward education. This was the period that killing a panda stopped being a death penalty offence, for example. And starting in 1997, a government project was set up to try and address the conflict between panda wildlife and the rural people who had to live near them. A sprawling research centre was also built in Chengdu to help educate people about the panda. And this made the capital of Sichuan very quickly the world capital for panda research. And all of this worked. The 2013 National Survey of the Giant Panda found that the wild panda population had increased to 1,864, while its wild habitat had expanded to 25,766 square kilometres. Not a full recovery by any means, but enough to take the panda off the endangered species list. China had come a long way since Father Ramon's first discovery of the panda back in 1869. The hard work of Chinese conservationists and the good press attached to panda diplomacy meant that at the beginning of the 21st century, the panda had been firmly established as China's national symbol.
Panda, panda, he can rock.
In October 2021, China announced the creation, to much fanfare, of 5 new massive national parks. The one that grabbed headlines around the world, however, was the establishment of the Giant Panda National Park. Some reports read this as an effort to save the panda from extinction, but honestly at this point the panda is probably one of the most protected animals on Earth. Short of complete collapse of the Chinese government, the panda is probably going to be fine. And in a weird way, the protection the panda now enjoys is thanks, at least in part, to Ruth Harkness and Father Ormonde. Today, the panda is integrally tied with China's image of itself, both domestically and on the world stage. Yet China has many endemic animals, many of whom are just as cute as the giant panda. For most of Chinese history, the giant panda then was not viewed as anything more special than, say, the golden stubbed nose monkey or the crested ibis. But for some reason, Americans in particular love the giant panda. And that love became infectious. Western hunger to see more pandas meant that Chinese people looked more at pandas. And the more they looked, the more they liked what they saw. Now, I am not saying that Westerners are responsible for saving the panda, nor am I saying that the panda and pandamania is entirely because of the West. By the 20th century, China has taken complete ownership of the image of the panda as a national symbol. An example of this can be seen in the field of diplomacy. From 1984 onward, all panda cubs are Chinese citizen, and China does not allow dual citizenship. What this means is, with the exception of a couple of pandas left over in Mexico, wherever you go in the world and encounter a panda, that panda is Chinese. The government even gives them official IDs. This is because by the late 20th century, China saw the panda as an important part of its national identity. It is no coincidence that the 1984 citizenship decision coincides with the beginning of modern conservation efforts at home. However, culture is complicated, and I think it's quite cool that foreigners saw this animal that Chinese people had been living with for thousands of years with new eyes. And that new perspective helped open up China's new love for a very old friend. Okay, thank you for watching. If you like what you saw, please like, share and subscribe. If you want to follow me on social media, on Bluesky and Twitter and all that kind of stuff, the links are down below. Down below in the description you will also find a link to all of the sources I used in this video. If you have any questions or any panda stories you want to share, please leave a comment down below as well.